So our study this morning is on love and charity. And we sought the understanding and basis for it on the Gospel According to Spiritism, the Spirit's book, Heaven and Hell, and this nifty little book I found over the weekend that is by Divaldo Franco and the Spirit Amelia Rodriguez, with a story that she brings us on the topic of forgiveness, which is in truth part of our study today. So in the book Heaven and Hell, there's a quote that says that charity and love are two drives behind a powerful attraction. They form a tie which binds the union of souls and which continues regardless of distance and place. I loved this quote, and beginning with this to try to give foundation and basis for our study this morning. Because they're basically stating that this powerful attraction, this drive behind this powerful attraction that unites people, the souls, they don't specify whether they're of our immediate family or people we encounter along the way, continues regardless of distance and place. And we see a lot of the testimony from the spirits in the spirit world about those that assisted them when they were alive. And we brought here an example a few weeks ago in the presence of Dr. Bezerra de Menezes, where he was received by thousands of spirits that he had assisted while he was alive, incarnated in the physical body, that he had no idea who they were, but he truly just practiced charity and love in abundance, regardless of whom they were. And so they say here that this powerful attraction forms a tie that binds the union of all souls, regardless of where they are in the universe. I found this to be so amazing because when we talk about the spiritual family and the universal family, and the fact that we are all children of the same Father of God, this starts making a lot of sense when we start thinking in this aspect, in its wholesomeness. And it goes far and beyond the aspect of being charitable and loving with the people that are right next to us when we start encompassing those that are in our culture, in our society, in the spiritual center, wherever we may find ourselves. Today's study, we're going to try to focus on this aspect and try to understand what exactly the spirits meant by being charitable and being loving, and also focusing on the just aspect of being charitable and loving as well. So we went to the one and only Paul the Apostle to try to bring a little bit of knowledge also on the need for charity according to Paul. Now, this part here of his letter to the Corinthians was written at a time where the folks in Corinth needed to realize the true aspects of love and try to deviate a little bit from the earthly passions that they were so much engulfed in. And so he brings this saying here where most people read in weddings, you know, even if I were to speak all the languages, we know this, but he employs the word charity here in the Gospel According to Spiritism. And we try to understand, why did they employ the word charity as opposed to the word love? Because when I first read this in English, I said, oops, the translator made a mistake. He put the word charity instead of love. So there's a little note on the bottom of the Gospel According to Spiritism on this one chapter where they explain the word charity as the word agape, which is love in the highest degree that one person can actually achieve. And it actually means love in action.
In Greek.
Huh?
In Greek.
In Greek, thank you, my helper. So love in action in Greek. So Paul defined charity not as a material beneficence point of view only. He was basically talking about a collective effort of all of the qualities and virtues that we possess inside, even if they still lay dormant and we haven't yet developed them into a flower. It's a seed that is waiting to be blossomed out. And so we see here that what he's talking about is Christian love. Agape, selfless, sacrificial, unconditional love. In our daily lives, we know the different types of love that a person may experience. Some of us in all of them, until we reach this highest degree. And so today we're going to try to bring you guys the 3 steps to agape love based on the Gospel According to Spiritism. And it's really interesting because as we are going to see, throughout our lives, when we experience these three different types of love until we get to the highest degree of love of all of them, we are going to find that in essence, we all have this seed waiting to germinate inside each and every one of us. 2,000 years ago, we had a man whose essence of true love came to exemplify what love truly was for us. And in all of his lessons, he employed the need to put into practice the agape form of love. And so Jesus comes and he shows us the true definition of what charity means. Who remembers that? You don't need to answer that now. But we are going to find out here. So let's see. The spirits tell us that love summarizes Jesus' doctrine in its entirety because it is the sentiment par excellence, and sentiments are instincts raised to the height of degree of progress accomplished. So they're talking about our spiritual progress. And here you have this little guy who is balancing out a little bit of there. You know, he's trying not to fall. And we see that we already know that we evolve intellectually and morally, where we put our feelings into practice, but we also use our intellect as well, because that's how we evolve. We progress both intellectually and morally. And so they continue telling us that at our origin, we have only instincts. More advanced and corrupted, we have only sensations. More educated and purified, we have sentiments. And we remember Allan Kardec telling us to instruct and educate ourselves. And so they're talking about here is our evolutionary progress. Animals have fragmented moments of intelligence. We, at the stage of evolution that we find ourselves in, we have fragmented moments of being charitable. Does that make any sense? Right? Usually when a destruction, a calamity strikes, Eduardo one day had this amazing talk about the transitioning of the world. And he, brought us some pretty powerful aspect of how we are able to really respond at a moment of disaster. And this is a pretty phenomenal thing that we have inside of us, that we are able to already respond to other people's suffering. But can we go beyond that? Can we go and find and search for those that aren't necessarily screaming at the top of their lungs that they need help? And so as we progress, we start understanding that as much as we have all of these basic needs of being loved, of having all of the other qualities that we hope from other people, they are going to need that from us as well. And that is why Mother Teresa said that people were hungry for love. Not in the aspect that she would go and feed them, but she was able to look at them as Jesus himself laying before her in need of assistance. And so the hunger for love that she was talking about was about this sentiment, this feeling of embracing somebody and making them feel like a human being. Not just an object there that was there to try to receive the help. So love is this divine essence that is deep within each and every one of us. But how do we get there? And here's the story that I thought was appropriate for our study today. The parable of the Good Samaritan, which Martin Luther King himself used in his speech. And not just that, he brought us an idea of what he thought the parable actually meant. And I thought it was so powerful that he used this on his speech that marked us forever. But the way that he made us realize what this parable truly meant for us to have an idea. So this doctor of the law asked Jesus what he should do to possess eternal life. Now he's a doctor of the law, so he's pretty aware of things. He's not just some simple person coming to Jesus and asking him this question. So he said, actually, Jesus answers with a question. What is it written in the law? What have you read in it? And he says, you shall love your Lord. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus says, so he says to him, who is your neighbor? Actually, he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? So Jesus starts telling him about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And he starts telling him, a certain man was coming down from Jerusalem to Jericho. From the top, I've been to the mountaintop, Isn't that how he starts, Martin Luther King? He says that I've been to the mountaintop, because he actually visited the site where Jerusalem comes down to Jericho below sea level. And he explained this road down, which is his own vision, and we're going to try to incorporate this here. We are going to see that Jesus used the most despised person by the Jews to try to exemplify the teachings on the one who is our neighbor and how to practice this love. So the Samaritans, so that we can have an idea, the gospel explains to us who were the Samaritans. They tell us that after the split up of the 10 tribes, Samaria, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, became the capital of the rebellious kingdom of Israel. So the Samaritans built their own temple and adopted certain reforms. They accepted the Pentateuch, but that contained the law of Moses, but they rejected anything that came from it. So they were very strict on what they would follow, their religious beliefs. And also, the Jews didn't necessarily like the Samaritans very much for how they actually led their religious beliefs and other things. They were so despised by the Jews that when Jesus tells them the parable, that a priest came down, saw the Samaritan laying there, and didn't do anything. Then a Levite comes by to the same spot, to the other side, sees the same man laying there and doesn't do anything. And then he uses a Samaritan as an example, who was also on a journey, coming down from Jerusalem, was touched with great compassion. And this is where we are going to see Karen Armstrong, who has created the Charter for Compassion, telling us the need to try to develop compassion inside of us and what it truly means to be religious. And we are going to see here that the two previous ones were religious people. Different kind of religion, but they were religious. He approached him and utilized all of his efforts to try to tend for the man that was lying there. Now it's important because it says a certain man. So Jesus doesn't tell them whether he was Jewish, whether he was a Samaritan. He doesn't tell them where he is from. He's beaten up, unrecognizable, left for dead, naked. And so one of the explanations that they do have is that a Levite and a priest, in order not to spoil themselves, they weren't supposed to touch anything unclean or dead or that was considered dirty. Furthermore, they didn't know what tribe or what culture this certain man was from. So they were going in accordance with what their religious beliefs was telling them to do. Now, Martin Luther King comes and says that there's another aspect to consider. He says that the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was a really dangerous one. It was full of ambushes. So maybe the two of them were a little bit concerned of what could happen to them if they stopped along the way to help the man who was bruised and left beaten for dead. But Martin Luther King says the Samaritan looked at the man and he didn't say, "What's going to happen to me if I stop and help him?" He said, "If I do not stop to help this man, what's going to happen to him?" And so I found this to be so amazing because Karen Armstrong will tell us that in order for us to start building compassion in religious doctrines, regardless of what religion doctrine we choose for ourselves, she says that more than belief, we also need to start putting the teaching into practice, that belief alone is empty. And she says that when we put the beliefs into practice, automatically this summons us up to our action. What are we going to do with the religious beliefs that we have? Which is what the Samaritan did. He didn't care who the man was or where he was from or what dangerous conditions he could be placing himself in. He just acted on behalf, filled with great compassion. She goes on to telling us that compassion is this driving force behind the movement where we start behaving differently when we start putting the teachings into practice. And this is exactly what inner reform is about. If we have this religiousness feeling that connects us to a higher power above, that summons us up to act differently, then we are putting into practice the religious teachings that we are hearing and learning about, as opposed to just believing in it. And so, She says that when we have compassion, we take ourselves out from the center of our own world, where it's all about me, and we put someone else there. And so we start seeing other people suffering and not just our own suffering. And we start feeling this aspect that we need to do something on behalf of someone else. And this is why I loved the beginning study slide where it said this powerful drive that actually puts into action being charitable and loving, that forms this union that binds us forever. It doesn't matter where in the universe we may find ourselves in. And so she talks to us about working on the issue of the ego. But how did the Samaritan get there? Between three people with different religious doctrines or beliefs or understanding of what was right or wrong, how do we get to the point of being the good Samaritan in the story? So we are going to see that Allan Kardec asked the spirits what was the true meaning of the word charity as Jesus understood it, which is a pretty profound question. Denise, remember we just did this week? We had this question here, and we started talking about what does it mean to be charitable as Jesus understood it. And so the spirits answered: benevolence towards everyone, indulgence towards the imperfections of others, and forgiveness for offenses. And then they say that love and charity actually supplements with the law of justice, because loving our neighbor is doing everything unto them that we would wish them to do unto us. So it goes back to the golden rule of applying everything that we would wish somebody would do to us. So love one another as brother, or as the answer for the doctor of the law when he said, who was the neighbor of the person that was left dead and beaten on the side of the road? And even though the doctor of the law couldn't enunciate the words and say the Good Samaritan or the Samaritan, he said the one who had shown mercy on him. And so the person that are next to us are the ones that we are going to show mercy on them. But then they're talking about being benevolent, being indulgent, and he goes up a step, being forgiving, which is really hard for us to do at times. Charity, according to Jesus, is not restricted to almsgiving, but embraces all our relationships with our fellow human beings, whether in situations below, equal, or superior to our own, is what the spirits will tell us in the Gospel according to Spiritism. And so they start telling us that in order for us to wish for people to be indulgent towards our imperfections, which we are still kind of filled of, it also says that if it applies the law of justice, we also need to start applying a little bit of indulgence towards other people's imperfections as well. And that if we are truly charitable, we are going to try to seek to uplift a person's position when we see that they're imperfect, instead of humiliating them. It doesn't mean that we agree with how they are, but the last thing a person who is filled with imperfections and fragility needs is somebody else pointing out exactly what they already know they have inside. Because we know how much that hurts. If we are a selfish person and somebody points out how selfish we are, does that help us to judge them to being selfish? Are we being constructive in that way? Or can we point it out in another way where we are not belittling them or putting ourselves in a superior position where we really don't have a place yet? And so this is what they're talking about, building on the need of being a little bit of indulgent with other ones. And they say that Christ didn't put as one of the means of reaching this kind of purity, that he didn't place charity as one of the conditions. They said that he placed as the condition for our progress, which is pretty amazing, because it says that being charitable, when we apply all of these three, it actually brings about all of the other qualities that we have inside of us in forms of seeds waiting to germinate. So let's go one by one. The 3 steps towards love, as we see here. The first one we have benevolence. Charity is going to automatically, when we start seeing this aspect of charity in benevolence, we are going to find that it's going to bring out other qualities inside of us, What are some of this quality? Kindness, humility, benevolence, being good. And we are going to find that although it's very good to say all of this, how do we practice this one aspect of charity for those that we have a hard time with, our so-called enemies? Isn't loving our enemy kind of contrary to the natural way of things? How we develop this feeling? You know, it's pretty easy right now to be able to be benevolent and indulgent and forgiving with somebody that I have already formed this tie. Like when Susanna is annoying with me, you know, I can be benevolent with her and kind because it's already been developed over thousands of years in the spirit plane. But somebody that we have a bit of a harder time with, where this hasn't been built yet, there is a lack of sympathy between spirits. It's a matter of chemistry, right? Or the law of cause and effect that brings us into the home of the same person. The spirits will tell us that it's obviously not possible to show tender, passionate love towards one's enemies. And that is not what Jesus wanted to say. And they go on saying that loving one's enemies means to forgive them and to return good for their evil. And this is how we put ourselves above them, by seeking vengeance, and we only place ourselves beneath them. So it's about wishing them well, even though we don't necessarily want to live in the same, room with them. Doesn't necessarily mean that, but we start working on this aspect of being kind, of wishing them well. I don't necessarily like little Jack, but I wish him well. I want him to have a happy life. I don't want him to suffer as much as he made me suffer. We start understanding that there is a lot bigger law of the universe that rules everything, and that I'm not suffering just because. God is not punishing me just because, and it's not about punishment. It's about progress and growth. And when we understand that and we accept this relationship, we start having a little bit more ability to be able to wish someone else well, hope for good things towards them. This starts bringing us about the path to indulgence. This is where I found it to be pretty amazing, because one of the teachings that Christ brought us was about the aspect of throwing the first stone. In the case of the woman who committed adultery, right? There's a beautiful story in this book here that shows truly what happened between the husband and the wife, where the husband of the woman who committed adultery knew that she was being unfaithful, and he decided to catch her in the act. This is through the mediumship of Divaldo Franco, where Amélia Rodrigues narrates the story. And so he encounters the wife with other witnesses that he called upon to witness the fact that she was being unfaithful. He doesn't even leave her time to get dressed. He drags her out into the public place. They throw her in front of Jesus, and they talk about the fact that they would stone her for the wrong that she had committed, her sin. And so Jesus looks at them and says, "Let him who have no sin cast the first stone." And then Amélia Rodrigues narrates the story on how Jesus looks at the eyes of the husband. And he doesn't say anything, but he himself, through the loving gaze of the master, starts considering the fact that he couldn't do what he was saying, because he remembered that many nights he sought the companionship of the woman who sold illusions for a living. That he couldn't demand from her the kind of fidelity and love that he himself wasn't showing. That many times she sought in him love and comfort, and he acted indifferent. That maybe there were many other occasions where the act that she committed, maybe he assisted in causing that situation. And so Amélia Rodrigues says to us in this lesson that we should try to avoid ratifying or examining the weaknesses of others through the dark lenses of our own soul, because we don't have the clarity to see. And furthermore, we can't see the history of other people, what they've been through, the kind of baggage that they bring that actually brings them to make a mistake. That it's not black and white like that. That we don't have the right or position to be able to judge someone. And in being indulgent with the imperfections of others. The story ends up with him actually looking for the wife after all of them leave. Jesus looks at her and he says, "Women, no one threw a stone. No one judged you. I won't either. Go and don't sin anymore." And Amelia Rodriguez says that the gospel doesn't come to try to impose, but rather to bring us the idea that we should become responsible for our own actions and modify them. And that's what he does in a loving way. And it's something that was brought up as a reminder this morning that people are mostly fragile and not evil. And Susanna says this a lot. That a lot of the mistakes that we commit are not because we're evil and mean, but we have fragilities inside, weaknesses inside that are going to be worked and developed over time. And it doesn't mean that we agree with the, I asked Marcella, so did it make okay then that the woman committed adultery? And it's not about that. It's about realizing that we are all interconnected and there are reasons behind why people make mistakes. The husband looked for the wife and they reconciled. It's the aspect of forgiveness. It's the other step that we have here. There is this psychiatrist. I'm going to go back to this one here, but this psychologist, Sonja Lyubomirsky, that says that forgiveness is a shift in thinking. She says, towards someone who has wronged you, such that your desire to harm that person has decreased, and your desire to do him good or benefit your relationship has increased. Now this is pretty amazing because a lot of relationships break or come apart because of the fact that people aren't willing to do this shift in thinking. Now if we already realize that there is a moment where we have to be indulgent with mistakes that are made because we are also deserving of being indulgent, how many relationships, like in the reconciliation of the adulterous woman and the husband, after he saw the lesson in Jesus' gaze about being loving and forgiving, how many relationships would benefit from this shift in the idea, in thinking towards someone else who has wronged us? And that is why there are psychologists available to try to help the person through this. Because the relationships that we have, they're valuable for us. In spouse relationships. In daughter, mother, father, sister, brother, sister relationship. That's why they exist, to try to help us in shift this idea, the way that we think about the mistake that was done to us. And then Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who is a writer, he comes and says that if we could read the secret history of our enemies, that we should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all of our hostility. Now to me, that was all of the three steps together. Benevolence, indulgence, and forgiveness. Which is a pretty powerful remark that he makes here. Now considering that we are immortal beings, and we also bring our own, in our history, our own sorrow, sufferings, lessons, different experiences, others are going to bring them as well. And so we start trying to develop and seeing in the person before us, ourselves. How would I wish for somebody to act with me if I was in their shoes? But for kind of doing this kind of work where Jesus brings us, they tell us that when we forgive, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are okay with what the person did to us. We acknowledge that it was hurtful and it was wrong. There is a time where Sonja says that it's okay to distance ourselves from people we know will do us harm again. Because there are certain situations where that happens, right? Sometimes we don't need to be anybody's, what's the word in English? Punching bag, right, Elaine? We don't need to put ourselves into that. But it comes into the realization here that we desire them well. That we don't desire to do to them the same thing that they did to us. And the Gospel according to Spiritism will bring us a knowledge saying that we should look deep down inside ourselves to discover if we ourselves weren't the aggressor. If we didn't throw the first punch, meaning the word, harsh word. If we didn't contribute for the kind of relationship that arises where forgiveness now is going to have to take place. They tell us also that if we didn't prevent the outcome of the situation and it depended on us, that we are accountable for that as well. So we can't put 100% blame on one person. Also because there's always two sides of the story. The way I see the truth of what happened is going to differ from the way Sandra sees it. I'm going to say, Sandra was really mean to me. And Sandra's going to say, my God, I came in this morning, I said something to Andrea, she gave me a rude answer, and so I didn't talk to her anymore. She had a reason. And then I saw it another way. And that's why it's so powerful that Amelia Rodriguez tells us that we shouldn't try to examine the situation of the offenses through the dark lenses of our souls, because we don't have the true clarity of evidences of the truth. And so we see that forgiving doesn't mean minimizing, justifying, or excusing the wrong that was done to us. It doesn't mean putting ourselves in a position to be harmed again. And she says that also the one thing that we need to try to do is seek assistance in shift in thinking on the situation to try to assist us to build and benefit the relationships existing before they fall apart. And now we already know the aspect of having to reconcile with our enemies while we are on the way with them. That was the teaching that was brought to us, and it is always, always brought up in Spiritism. Reconciling with our enemies, our adversaries, the people that we have a hard time with, and most often found in our families. That's what it means. And in order for us to be able to do that, we need to start understanding how and why it's going to benefit our relationship, to modify the way that we think. When we find that we are doing all of this through this gradual process that is going to take some time, we will eventually reach love agape, which is the one aspect that we are searching for in these 3 simple steps that are filled with so many learning experiences for us to be able to develop this kind of high level of feeling that actually makes us transcend above whom we are, in essence, as spirits.